Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, one and all. Thanks for joining us in this edition of IT Mythbusters. We are in episode number 5. If you are joining us for the first time, I and Mike share a lot of myths around that is floating in the industry and trying to find out, is it true or we bust it at the end of the session. So hi, Mike. I hope you're doing well.
Hi, Suresh. Great to be back with you.
Excellent. So what is the topic for today that you'd like to debate? Is it a myth or bust it? That is more often coming in all conversation with your clients and partners and the entire ecosystem. When it comes to digital transformation, a lot of things are happening around. What is it?
A lot of things going on. I think the one I want us to tackle today is about open source.
Okay.
And what I have heard leadership say is that we can save a whole bunch of money by going to open source because open source is free.
Oh, okay.
So that's what I want to tackle today. Let's talk about open source. And is open source really free?
Okay, that's a great point, a great topic. So let's start for viewers to understand the genesis of open source, right? Typically, the way industry has perceived, we have had proprietary tools, vendor tools. They have a level of abstraction, so you cannot do a lot of customization beyond a point. So there was always an element of control that organizations have enjoyed over a period of time working with a lot of product-based companies and vendors. So what do you think was the starting point of open source evolution? What triggered those concept of open source at the first place, and how long had it been in place now?
Well, I think open source kind of came out of the idea that if we work together, we can produce better results, right? And if you think about some of the concepts like peer programming, where if you have somebody walking alongside and reviewing your code, you're able to find bugs that are created. Open source is kind of a community peer review, right? And so I think as technologies were evolving, the internet came along, we started to have better ways for us to share what we were doing in the programming space. People had this idea of, well, let's just put our code out there and let others review it and help make it better. And I think that was kind of the start of open source.
Excellent, right? And it is a very good context because we are trying to help each other. There is a community sharing. There is no reinvent of the issue again, and helping and supporting around it. And that is it's a good thing, right? It's a good thing. It's a good way to co-own things and build it. So is it also bringing in a little bit of element on security? Because I have seen sometime when you look at open source code and when we import it, be it a part of snippets, there's a lot of vulnerability and threats that come attached to it. So would that something be to watch out when it comes to open source things, because of the way that you have your code base in GitHub or Bitbucket and stuff, and we import that, it becomes a little more challenging because some of those open source code needs to go through a proper security threat and vulnerability analysis?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, right? If we think about open source, I can put my code out there, right? Correct. But at the end of the day, it's got to be interesting enough for the community to engage, right? So I may put out some code for a new system for a fantasy football pool, right? And if the community is not interested in fantasy football, they're not going to engage. They're not going to help my code. They're not going to review for the security, right? The idea with open source is that if we've got an idea, right, I can put out and contribute my thoughts as the starting point, and then other people can come in, leverage what I did, build on top of it and make it better, right? And then they give back what they've done, and we're all able to kind of use the best of all of the minds. But again, if it's not an area that people are interested in, they're not going to spend the time to do that. A lot of times, the areas of open source code that have gotten the most traction are areas where either a company has invested in their developer community and kind of given their developer community the okay to contribute code that they developed in working hours
Right.
back to the community, or it's people that are spending their own time volunteering to write code or review code and are contributing for the greater good.
Correct.
And so it really is dependent on the topic. Some topics, the code that you're going to pull down has been reviewed by thousands upon thousands of people,
Right.
and it may be pretty damn bulletproof.
Correct.
Right?
Absolutely.
Other topics, it may have been you and me, and we're the only ones that ever looked at this thing, and there might be security holes all over the place.
Right.
So you have to be cognizant of that in the open source space. When you pull down code, yeah, it might be a good starting point, but you have to understand the quality of what you're getting. You have to understand who has reviewed the code and how many people have reviewed the code. You have to understand what kind of licensing restrictions have been put on the code. Right. So some people that contribute to open source are willing for you to leverage what they contributed in any way that you want. Other people say that you can use my stuff, but you have to tell everybody that I was the person that built it.
Right.
Or you can use my stuff, but you can't change it. Right. You can build on top of it, but don't touch it. Right. If you change anything here, then we got a problem. Right. So the licenses related to open source are a really important part of the puzzle that you have to understand as well.
That's great. So one of the things, if you look at it, a lot of people don't understand that open source is something that we are toying around and seeing it. But one of the things people have an inclination towards open source is that they can look at the deepest level of code, which typically has never been a developer's paradise. If I look at other systems that you have traditionally have, there's a level of abstraction beyond which you need to write your REST APIs and bring in that web services call and other stuff. So it's kind of hidden treasure. So developers have always been handicapped by not going into that entire code base and finding out what's happening, because intuitively a lot of developers have this name of, I want to crack this code, I want to get this one. So that was, I think, also one of the reasons why people find fascinating to look at open source, because they go to the core of what it exists and why it exists and how it exists. So it's kind of being a developer myself in about 2001 to 5, I find it that fascinating. Do you think so, that developers find a lot more joy when they kind of work with open source because of the level of access that they get to go at that code base, at the most important base that you never otherwise get access to?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a part of it, right? When you can see the code, you get insight into the thought process. Right. And so by looking at other people's code, looking at how they wrote the code, what they were thinking, how they were interpreting the business requirements in that particular instance, you're able to learn, you're able to get better. Right. And so again, to your point, if you buy packaged software and that the underlying code is sitting in a language that you can't understand, it might be decompiled, or you may not have kind of that full access to actually see the code. You can't learn from that, right? You have to read documentation. You have to go on what the company is telling you. But if you can see the code, you can learn from it. And I think there's a lot of people that learn by seeing what other people have done, taking and borrowing code snippets, trying it out, seeing what happens. So yeah, I think that's a really big part of why open source is so interesting to so many developers.
Right, and particularly in the database industry, if you look at it, there's a lot of push towards NoSQL, and you have now tools like MongoDB, Cassandra, Postgres. So is that kind of open source more towards the databases that people are now kind of adopting? Because earlier, if you remember, we had a large RDBMS like Oracle, SQL, which made a lot of sense in terms of transaction data. And now with a lot of unstructured data like big data and other stuff, do you think that there is a lot more push towards these open source NoSQL databases?
Well, there has been a lot of push, and one of the reasons why, particularly in the database space, is that there's been a little bit of a kind of, what's the right way to say it? A monopoly on the market almost. Not quite a monopoly, it's more of a duopoly. It's been largely Oracle and SQL Server, right?
Yeah.
As the two really big dogs for a number of years. There were others, obviously.
Right.
You go back and look at DB2 and others, but those companies, if you look at the licensing constructs, neither Oracle or Microsoft are necessarily known for making licensing easy to understand or making their licensing cheap, right? So Oracle typically, historically, has been kind of viewed as a premium database, and the licenses for Oracle databases were typically very expensive. Now, not to say you didn't get value out of that. There's some really powerful capability in an Oracle database.
Right.
The SQL Server database licenses historically were a little bit less expensive, and so as organizations evaluated what kind of capability they needed, they would choose there. But now, what some of these open source databases, like you mentioned, now open up the option for is you can get most of the functionality, maybe not all of the functionality of an Oracle or SQL Server, but you get most of the functionality for a much lower price point. Right. But as you mentioned, you don't necessarily get a MongoDB or Cassandra or one of these for free.
Right.
So
that's the point of coming back to that, tying down to open source being free. Now, a couple of things that we have to play it out here. Now, generally, open source code, open source tools, or open source community was focused on doing experimentation. We talk about experimentation and learning. So for us to do something, instead of buying something and regretting, you kind of gave an environment, like a fail-safe environment for you to practice. But it's not for commercial interest. So there is a little bit of difference between looking at open source for practicing towards looking at open source for a commercial product kind of stuff. So is that a distinction very clearly understood by people when they talk about open source? Because there are two versions of the whole thing that we need to think about. There is an open source, which is available for free to play around, to understand, fail-safe experimentation in a environment of a limit blast radius. But then there is another part when we think that, okay, we are going with Jenkins, we are going to go with the whole stack in a manner that using Kubernetes, and this is open source, we cannot go through it because that was given, but it costs money. And there's a commercial license also applicable when it comes to something, because you need to also have some support getting to once you kind of onboard these applications in your pipeline.
Yeah, to your point, right? I think this is we go back to the licensing, right? It depends on for each kind of software, what kind of license is that software being made available under, and a lot of the license options don't allow you to use software for commercial use, as you mentioned. So there's two costs there. One is a cost, a time and energy, and maybe even a legal cost, getting your lawyers involved to understand the licensing structures of open source, right? So you have to be able to figure that out. That's a cost.
Right.
And then if you need to use open source software in an enterprise setting, there may be a cost associated with licensing in an enterprise setting.
Right.
Typically, it's less than the license costs for some of these other softwares that we talked about, but there is still a cost. Right. And then the third thing is, well, what happens when there's a bug, right? And in the open source community, right, again, we talked about it, it's all volunteer.
Right.
So if there's a bug, you share it out with the community, and hopefully somebody comes in and helps you figure it out. Well, I don't know about your company, but in my company, that's not good enough, right? And so if something goes wrong, we need to get it fixed and get it back up and running.
Right.
So the third cost related to open source is really for that enterprise support.
Correct.
Companies that are coming alongside open source software and committing to support you and your enterprise in the use of the software. They may help you install it, they may help you configure it, set it up, and then if something goes wrong, they'll help you figure it out in a timely manner,
right,
rather than putting it out in the community and see what you get.
Yeah.
So I think those to me are kind of the three key costs associated with open source that to me says open source ain't free, right? At least not in an enterprise. It's the licensing, it's the legal understanding of the licensing and the risk it puts you in. It's the licenses themselves, and it's the enterprise support.
Well, that solves it for all, and you've made it clear. So what is your thought about the open source being free?
Myth busted.
It's busted.
Absolutely busted.
It's very clear and evident that whenever you're looking at for open source, please remember, if it's for an enterprise edition, and we are going to look at as a commercial product, there are these costs that we talked about, the licensing cost, the legal underlying layer, and the support, because you would not want to wait for one morning and say that someone in the community will come there and solve my problem in 2 weeks. I mean, you're on fire with your customers. So you better kind of get an enterprise level support that gets it and move forward. So remember, open source is good. It gets a great opportunity. It gives you a lot of options, but you need to know where you're heading to if you're looking at open source enterprise level product. Okay, so we say that this busted. Thanks, Mike, for joining in this edition. I hope we will join back again with another edition of IT Mythbuster. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Suresh. Enjoyed it. Bye.